Check, check, check. Check, check, check. Check, check, check. Check, check. Check, check. All right. So, what's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. Today is February 1st, 2025, and this is the beginning of Black History Month. Happy Black History Month to everybody out there. I hope you're able to do some studying, do some reading, do some protesting, do some civic or civil disobedience. Do something to continue to affirm Black life and your own humanity. And I'd have to say, I haven't been going live as recently because I've been traveling. Earlier this week, I just came back from America. I posted up all the videos that were loaded up in my phone of all the trips and adventures we've been in the US and also while here in Budapest as well. So go check out that content and subscribe to my second travel channel that I share with my wife called Backpack Bandits. That's where we, show more of our adventures and more behind the scenes stuff. But on this channel, it's not primarily as much travel content as it used to be in the past. Now it's more about academia and studying, and this is book 9. That 9, baby, we in that 9 for Book React, and we are reading Slave Breeding, Sex, Violence, and Memory in African American History, written by Gregory D. Smithers. This is a book that I have not had on my agenda calendar for some time because it wasn't like a topic that I really wanted to delve into because it's so horrific. And also just knowing that it existed feels like it's enough for me. But that's not how we should think about history. That's not how we should think about learning. We shouldn't think that we know everything before ahead of time, because the previous book we read, White Women, Black Men, Illicit Sex in the 19th Century South by Martha Hodes, which was an excellent book, contained so much information that I did not know about what it was like in the antebellum South and in America in general. And so when we see this topic that some of us are already familiar with, and we haven't read a book about it, it shouldn't be that we just turn away because we're scared to look at it. And I think this is important to read for Black History Month too, because we have to remember what our ancestors went through. And we should always be thankful that we are here living as testaments to their survival and their strength and their resistance as well. And, right now there's a major attack going on, I would argue, across the world, that is fueled on anti-Blackness, but particularly in the US with this new administration and just the general climate as well, that seems to be attacking anything related to Blackness, whether that be DEI or critical race theory. Who knows? They might be going for Black studies programs in the future at universities. So anything is on the table right now. We are constantly under attack, but we need to always reaffirm our own humanity, continue to read and study, honor our ancestors, and continue to inculcate within us curiosity as well. So that's why I wanted to pick this book for Black History Month. I'm going to try to read maybe 2 books on Livestream this month, and this is one of them. If you have any other ideas, let me know. So like I said, this book was written by Gregory D. Smithers. It was published originally in 2012. The paperback illustrated version was published in 2013. You can find this on Amazon for the humble price of only $18.39 in paperback, and a hardcover seems to not be available, but it's still out there. It has good reviews on Amazon as well. And this is not paid promotion. I have not been paid to promote any products on my channel, due generally to the content that I put out. But I always, in the first episode of any book react I do, I always go into the background of the author, because we have to remember we don't just pick up any book without trying to do some basic research. And there are other books about slave breeding, but the authors weren't as reputable. And I always try to strive with the information that I provide to y'all to give it from a source that is reputable, respected, that has some academic credentials, right? I think the bare minimum for any book that I read on this channel should be that the person has a Wikipedia page at least. You know what I mean? Preferably a Wikipedia page. They teach at a distinguished university, something like that, right? Because I'm tired of people coming into the comments section or the chat and saying, oh, Simon's just reading some BS. He doesn't know what he's talking about. These are well-respected scholars. So I'm going now to the website for Gregory D. Smithers. This is what you can see on his About page. And this is what he has to say about himself. He says, I am a professor of American history in the Department of History at Virginia Commonwealth University. I received my PhD in history from the University of California, Davis. I've taught in California, Hawaii, Scotland, and Ohio. I recently held a British Academy Global Professor based in the Treaties Spaced Research Cluster at the University of Birmingham in England. My research and writing focuses on environmental histories, the history of climate change, and settler colonial societies since the 18th century. I am particularly interested in the rich history of the Cherokee people and the intersection of Indigenous and African American history from the mountain South to California and beyond. My work is devoted to narrating the past in ways that are publicly accessible and connect with issues of social justice, environmental sustainability, and racial and gender equity. I am currently completing a book titled The Water Carriers, A Journey Through Cherokee History and the Secret Life of Rivers, which will be published through Pegasus Books. So for Black History Month, we're starting with a white author. We're starting with the words, the research from a white man. And I think this goes to show that, number one, Simon Hill Keeps It Real does not hate white people, because how can I hate white folks when most of the books I read are from white folks? And hey, some of you say my wife is white, so whatever. But yeah, we should always remember that allies and people that think deeply about Blackness can come from any walk of life. They don't have to be from our lineage or have our pigmentation to care about other people. I think this is a poignant moment to remember that, you know, many people, if you open your mind and your heart, you have the capacity to learn and also have the capacity to care about others. And that's what I think Greg Smithers, is going to be doing with this book. But let's continue here with more information. By the way, all the links that you can find are in the description of this video. It says Gregory Smithers, PhD, professor. This is from vcu.com, the website, the university he teaches at right now. And then this is his resume: PhD, History, Department of History, University of California, Davis, BA, First Class Honors, Australian Catholic University. Gregory Smithers is a professor of American history whose research and teaching focuses on the histories of Indigenous people and African Americans from the 18th century to the present. His work is particularly interested in the rich history of the Cherokee people, Indigenous history from the mountain South to California and the Southwest Pacific, environmental history, and the history of race, gender, and sexuality. His most recent book is Reclaiming Two Spirits: Sexuality, Spiritual Renewal, and Sovereignty in Native America. Professor Smithers is currently working on a history of waterways and Cherokee history. Funded by the British Academy, this research includes an interactive website entitled Cherokee River Keepers, a collaboration with the Digital Humanities Institute at the University of Sheffield. This lends more credence to the fact that this is a well-respected scholar. Here are his books right here. Here's his bibliography: The Cherokee Diaspora and Indigenous History of Migration, Resettlement, and Identity. Won many awards, as you can see right here. And here are the courses that he teaches: United States History to 1877, The Art of Historical Detection, American Frontiers, Aboriginal Australians, Native Southerners, Indigenous History in the American South, Native Americans in Modern America. I'll be honest, I would like to take that class, Native Southerners, because, you know, when we think about, you know, the Indigenous people in the South, they seem to not exist in my mind, like, about the history of them. When I think of Native Americans, I particularly think of them out west and also, you know, up north in like the Northeast section. But of course, there were Indigenous people that, you know, inhabited all of the Americas. But I don't know much about, you know, the different tribes and cultures that existed before colonization. So here are his recent awards: British Academy Global Professorship 2019, Virginia Humanities Fellow 2019, Wills Research Fellow, Tennessee Historical Society 2018, Visiting U.S. Fellow, Eccles Center for American Studies, British Library in 2015. So he's a young academic still getting awards. These are very recent awards. So shout out to Greg Smithers once again for all that he's accomplished, all of his scholarship. Once again, adding a little bit more context on who this man is. All right, so Gregory Smithers, born 1974, is a professor of American history at Virginia Commonwealth University in Richmond, Virginia, an ethno-historian. Smithers specializes in Native American and African American histories. Early life and education. Born in Sydney, Australia, once again showing that allies or people that open their minds can come from anywhere. Born in Australia, has nothing to do with America, comes from another settler colonial state, and still can, analyze the histories and empathize with people from different walks of life. Born in Sydney, Australia, Smithers received degrees from the Australian Catholic University and the University of California, Davis. In 2019, he was awarded a British Academy Global Professorship for his work on Indigenous environmental history in the United States and Australia. His career. Smithers is the author of numerous historical books, many of which focus on Native American and African American histories. In a 2022 interview with the Bay Area Reporter, Smithers said that he is attracted to topics most other historians have historically not touched or handled pretty shabbily. One of the most interesting things I learned about last semester in my sociology program, which I'm studying out here in Budapest, is about new history. I never heard about the study of new history, how historians are now looking at history not from great men perspectives or the idea of nations, but like from individuals, right? And it seems like, Gregory Smithers would fall under the category of like a new historian. So in 2012, he published Slave Breeding, Sex, Violence, and Memory in African American History, which addressed the history of slave breeding and the sexual abuse of slaves in the United States. In the book, Smithers also explores the historical memory of slave breeding in the African American community and its impact on the sexual objectification of Black people in contemporary culture. The book was praised for presenting multiple viewpoints by including a diverse set of sources. However, it received some criticism for conflating slave breeding with other types of abuse and the separation of enslaved families. Very interesting. So I think that's a good point right here to get away from his background, because it seems to be pretty solid. Jump into this book right now. So we're going to start Slave Breeding. We're only going to be reading the acknowledgements and the introduction. So it's going to be a shorter live stream. But tomorrow, hopefully, inshallah, we'll be reading chapter 1 as well. So let's go. Slave Breeding, Sex, Violence, and Memory in African American History, Gregory D. Smithers, University Press of Florida. Jumping on ahead. Here are the contents. Here are the names of the different chapters. We have the introduction, American Abolitionism and Slave Breeding Discourse, Slavery, the Lost Cause in African American History, Black History and Slave Breeding in the Early 20th Century, The Theater of Memory, the WPA Narratives in Slave Breeding, Sex, Violence, and the Quest for Civil Rights, Slave Breeding in Literature, Film, and New Media. And then there's an epilogue. So only about 175 pages in this book. So it should be pretty short. We might actually finish this much sooner. So let's go here. No dedication. Okay, well. In the course of writing this book, I received insights, criticisms, and suggestions from some wonderfully generous scholars. I am particularly indebted to my quote-unquote best man, Brian Benkin. Brian's own work will change our understanding of the civil rights movement, and I am eternally grateful to him for taking time away from his work to give his detailed and careful reading of much of this book. I also extend my gratitude to David Barber, Trevor Burnand, Rebecca Fraser, Alan Galley, Kwasi Konadu, Peter Onoff, Ben Schiller, Carolyn Strange, Kathleen Wilson, and Michael Ondatajte, all of whom pushed me to think through various portions of my analysis. Special acknowledgement is owed to the brilliant Stephen Dule for the support he has offered for this project over the years. I thank you all for your counsel and take full responsibility for any shortcomings in the analysis that follows. Finally, I'd like to extend my appreciation to Meredith Morris Babb, the director at the University Press of Florida, for her continued support of this book. I'd also like to acknowledge one very important person, to Paul Spickard, one of the most generous and kind-hearted individuals I've had the good fortune to meet. I thank you for your guidance over many years. Paul has supported my career for some time, for his mentorship and the example he sets as a creative and original historian. I extend my deepest gratitude. Thanks also go to the University of Aberdeen and the Library Company of Philadelphia for providing financial support. This support enabled me to complete portions of the research for this book. I would also like to extend my thanks to the History Department and the Center for Cultural History at the University of Aberdeen for allowing me to present portions of my research. The feedback I received from these events helped to clarify my thinking on some critical areas of my analysis. And to Andrew McKillop, my mentor during my time at the University of Aberdeen, I am grateful for the time you took to listen to me talk about the subject matter contained in this book over many strong libations. You are a patient and very collegial man indeed. I cannot imagine like getting drunk with my friends and talking about slave breeding. Like, hey, bruh, back in the day, man, they used to throw the bags on our head and make us hump on our cousins. Like, what? Like, that's a wild thing to be doing over strong libations. Continuing. I owe a special word of acknowledgement and thanks to my colleague and friend, Clarence E. Walker. I would not have written this book had Professor Walker not instilled in me long ago the importance of reading widely, researching thoroughly, and unflinchingly analyzing history's more unpleasant events and people. Professor Walker's guidance as a teacher, his willingness to suffer and at times not to suffer, my impudence, and his generosity and good humor have played a major role in making me the scholar I am today. I would like to thank him for all that he has done for me and hope that he accepts this book as a token of my appreciation. So basically saying thanks to a teacher that sometimes was a dick and sometimes was the man that patted him on the shoulder and say, keep doing, man, keep researching slave breeding. You got this. Are you winning, son? All right. Finally, and most important, I want to thank the three treasured people in my life, Brooke, Gwyneth, and Simone. To my wife, Brooke Newman, words do not adequately express the depths of my appreciation for your love, support, and comfort. Brooke is my harshest critic and strongest supporter. Without her, this book would not have been written. Finally, a special message to my daughters, Gwyneth and Simone. Please continue to be adorable at all hours of the day and night. Okay, so there are some dedications. Shout out to the family. I could not imagine, Daddy, what are you writing about? I'm writing about slave breeding. Get out. Okay, like that's insane. Like, okay. Anyway, going now to the introduction. My master started out with 2 women slaves and raised 300 slaves. By the way, I will not be reading in like old slave dialect or broken African American English. I think a lot of the times those texts that are written that way were written by white folks who were saying like these are what the Negroes sounded like. When I don't think the slaves, actually spoke that broken English. So I won't be reading like that for the most part. If it happens, it happens. So once again, my master started out with 2 women slaves and raised 300 slaves. So testified John Smith, a 108-year-old former slave who was interviewed by a Works Project Administration employee in the late 1930s. Smith's testimony was as sensational as it was disturbing. He recalled that Short Peggy and Long Peggy, the 2 women his master started out with, were prized for their fecundity. If you don't know what fecundity means, that means fertility, how easily they could have children. The sexual exploitation that Smith claimed these women experienced led to the reproduction of slaves who enriched Smith's master through their labor or sale. But Smith also insisted that the exploitation of enslaved women like Short Peggy and Long Peggy resulted in the master appointing them to positions of authority among fellow slaves. Smith explained Long Peggy, a black woman, was boss of the plantation. Master freed her after she had 25 children. Just think of that. Smith concluded, raising 300 slaves with 2 women. It show is the truth, though. It really is the truth. Why did I know that's so annoying that somebody would write the black voice that way. And this is why it's important. I say this almost every live stream. It's important for black men, black people to write our own stories, because if we let the white folks tell our stories, they're going to say, you show is truthfully, that show is going to happen now. Like, no, we shouldn't let the white folks dictate how we talk or how we tell our stories. But this is crazy. So I didn't think about women gaining power by being forced to breed. And like a woman that had 25 children was freed by her master. See, I'd never thought about that. You know what I mean? Because of course they say the black woman is the most disrespected woman in the world, or at least in America, right? And you would think in the antebellum South that women would have even less power, especially black women, right? But I don't want to draw too many conclusions, but I'm just trying to make this point here. Like I said before opening this book, I didn't want to read about it because just knowing it exists makes me not want to study this subject. And on top of that, you feel like you already know enough that it's bad enough. But see, this is from the very first paragraph, I learned something, right? So let's continue here. Smith's memories of slave raising served to highlight the sexual exploitation that formed a critical part of many former slaves' memories of 19th century bondage in the American South. Slave breeding, as coercive, often violent, reproductive practices were known among the enslaved and their descendants. Structured African American historical, ethnographic, and cultural understandings of Black life in the United States. As former slaves like Smith recalled during the depths of the Great Depression, slave masters selected women who were purported to be particularly fecund. These women were to reproduce or breed future generations of slaves. As Smith remembered, Long Peggy's status among her fellow slaves rested on her master's assessment of her as an efficient breeder of slaves. Indeed, her master predicated her future freedom on the birth and survival of her 25th child. Perhaps this was why Smith never married before the war, aware as many slaves were that a history of violent sexual exploitation meant that nobody married on master's plantation. Smith's recollections, idiosyncratic as they may appear, force us to dig deeper into the historical significance of coercive and violent forms of reproductive sex during slavery. They also invite us to consider the implications that such memories have for the social and cultural context in which slavery was and is remembered. Reading Smith's account, one is confronted with insights into how former slaves and their descendants imagine the moral worldview that once anchored the daily life of the slave master, the plantation overseer, and the slave trader. Smith's master, Haywood Smith, was a preacher and was reportedly good to all of us N-words. I'm going to be saying N-words too, because anytime I say the actual word, even though I'm Black, YouTube demonetizes my video essentially. What then are we to make of Smith's memories of slave breeding? How do we make sense of a God-fearing man, a preacher like Haywood Smith, apparently encouraging slave breeding practices and allowing men like Tom Bridgers, the master's overseer, to have 160 children by N-words? Does the sexual violence conveyed in such recollections reveal the real motive for why slave owners like Haywood Smith was good to the N-words? And what do oral histories of this nature teach us about African American understandings of gender and sexual relations, to say nothing of the significance of family in Black culture? These are not easy questions to answer. Indeed, John Smith's memories reveal as much as they obscure, filtered through decades of personal experiences, ranging from memories of the whipping post on the slave plantation, the uncertainty of the Civil War, Jim Crow segregation, and the terror of lynch mobs. Smith's narrative of slave breeding paints a picture of Southern slavery that was brutally exploitative one minute and seemingly nurturing the next. These seeming contradictions in Smith's remembered history were echoed in the memories of many other former slaves. Slave breeding practices, they insisted, should not be dismissed, marginalized, or ignored in American history. They spoke to the immoral sense of slavery. This, as Smith remembered, it was the truth of slavery. This book tells the story of the truth of slave breeding from the perspectives of multiple generations of African Americans. Like all histories, this one is a subjective, quote unquote, truth. Focusing primarily on the 19th and 20th centuries, the following chapters explore the connections between life and death in American society and discuss the importance of family in African American history. Slave breeding is therefore a phrase with broad interpretive significance in Black American culture. It refers to more than the reproduction of human beings. It is a malleable narrative shorthand in which social norms, cultural values, and historical consciousness can be bred or learned over time. In other words, the use of breeding in African American articulations of slave breeding refers to two connected issues. First, slave breeding constitutes a narrative focal point that reveals how racial violence and sexual coercion have shadowed African American reproductive practices since slavery. Second, slave breeding functions as an historical trope that allows Black Americans to contextualize contemporary acts of racial and sexual violence against an exceptionally brutal historical backdrop. I mean, one of the things that remains generally unexplored in Black discourse generally is the sexual abuse that all of us have experienced just by the fact that we are Black, right? we deal with the memories and traumas of our ancestors, of course, in an epigenic way, but we also deal with sexual, psychological violence in the way that the Black body is caricatured in the minds of others. I've spoken about this on my channel before, right? About how the BBC fetish and the fetishization of the Black woman's body and different parts of that lead to the dehumanization of Blackness, right? Where all Black men are is a big walking penis. Where all Black women are these sexualized Jezebels and that sort of thing, right? We to various levels of degree and experience and age, right? We're all dealing with some sort of sexual trauma. Now, some of this sexual trauma is intracommunal, meaning it's coming from people that look like us and are socialized as Black as well, right? But then also there is, of course, the effects of white supremacy that affect all of us as well, that affect how we look at ourselves and our sexuality. So I think he's making a very good point here. And I just feel like about the breeding part, though, I feel like that it's still not as well known, right? Because you'll be surprised how many young Black folks in America don't know that much about the history of slavery other than it existed, right? And they don't know about the breeding farms because they definitely don't teach that in high school, especially where most Black folks live in the deep, deep, deep racist ass South. They're not teaching about the breeding farms. They're doing one paragraph to slavery, then they're jumping to the 1920s and the Gilded Age when they teach our children history in these high schools. All right, continuing here. Professional historians generally define slave breeding in much narrower terms. The most commonly used methodological approach to understand slave breeding is economic. Economic historians Robert Fogel and Stanley Eggerman set the standard for the empirical analysis of slave breeding with their groundbreaking book, Time on the Cross, 1974. They argued that slave breeding required the slave master's systematic interference in the normal sexual habits of slaves to maximize fertility through such devices as mating women with especially potent men. It is unclear whose standards of normal sexual habits Fengel and Elgerman were referring to, but on the matter of slave breeding, they found no demographic or economic evidence to indicate that interference ever occurred. Pardon, I have to blow my nose. I think I might be getting sick. Pardon, let me get a bandana. This has never happened before, and I promise it won't happen again. Whew. Sorry about that. Sorry about that. All right. So continuing here. It is unclear whose standards of normal sexual habits Fogel and Engerman were referring to, but on the matter of slave breeding, they found no demographic or economic evidence to indicate that interference ever occurred. Similarly, historian John Bowles argued in his seminal Black Southerners, 1984, that there is no reliable evidence that slave owners, as a general practice, interfered with the sex lives of slaves so as to maximize reproduction. Bowles based his argument on empirical data found in plantation records, the transaction of slave sales, and census statistics. Like many historians of his generation who addressed the question of slave breeding, Bowles did not pause to question the validity or accuracy of these sources of historical proof when it came to slave breeding. While we should not ignore economic and demographic data, it is important to keep in mind that the details, experiences, and emotions of human life are rarely found on the bottom line of a slave ship's manifest or a plantation owner's account book. Sources of this nature often make it difficult to grapple in detail with the violent sexual encounters that accompanied slavery and expressed complex dynamic power relations. Such is the case with slave breeding in American history writing. The economic definition has become so entrenched in the American historical profession that efforts to correct it are met with hostility, disbelief, or a combination of the two. Basically, what he's trying to say here is that some historians, even still in 2012 when he was writing this, did not believe that the slave breeding, the purposeful reproduction of Black folks through sexual exploitation for the purpose of profit did exist. This is still somewhat controversial. is what he's trying to say. In the course of researching and writing this book, I have encountered these reactions. I have repeatedly been told, mainly by white, senior, male historians, that slave breeding was not real, that the sources used to claim it was the truth. The writings of 19th century abolitionists, memoirs by former slaves, and oral histories are so skewed and biased that there is no possibility that such practices ever actually happened. In other words, there is assumed to be such a lack of tangible written economic and or commercial evidence to prove empirically that slave breeding ever occurred, that to pursue this topic would be like trying to transform a figment of one's imagination into something verifiably real. Okay, I think it's always ironic that whenever we start talking about the truth of history, right, white men continue to jump out the window and say, that's not true. Why is it? Why is it that white men continue to be barriers to honesty? What are they ashamed of? What are they hiding? What are they hiding? Because anytime you say anything about, slavery or the past or anything that's, a blemish on their record, they say that's not true. That it didn't happen that way. Or they gaslight and say, well, everybody was doing it. No, not everybody had breeding farms. Okay. So, memory, culture, and slave breeding. Historical perspective and scholarly methodologies have thus played a major role in the way slave breeding is understood in American history. Since the abolition of the international slave trade to the United States in 1808, generation after generation of Black Americans have discussed slave breeding as a reality of life in the slave South. In contrast, post-Civil War historians found that they could not describe slave breeding as a reality of Southern life after reviewing the archival documents of plantation owners, overseers, and slave traders. That the creation and preservation of these documents were the products of plantation bookkeeping, and it bears emphasizing the empirical sleights of hand involved in double entry bookkeeping, subject to the gendered and racial perspectives of their creators and of the archivists who filed them away for later reference, has long been overlooked when the topic of slave breeding crops up. Indeed, these sources shaped and continue to shape our historical perceptions of what is and is not historically important. As all historians know, archival documentation is the scaffold upon which we build our analysis. The absence of verifiable evidence often means there is not a reliable story to be told, or at least not a story that the historian feels comfortable telling without slipping into the world of popular history and fiction writing. And dare it be said, becoming an author of books that reach audiences outside the academy. For much of the 20th century, this meant that the histories about African Americans, Native Americans, immigrants, and women were left untold or only partially told, and the scholars who told them were ghettoized, as several historians have commented to me in women's or ethnic studies departments. So basically what he's trying to say here is that sometimes when people are studying these obscure, frankly shameful topics about history, particularly American history, they get marginalized. Despite a dearth of written and archival sources, analysis of subaltern histories has flourished since the 1960s and 1970s. And he's referring to new history, what I was talking about before. Indeed, if the historian of slavery hopes to get at the emotion and feelings of enslaved men, women, and children, he or she is often forced to compensate for a lack of archival documentation by drawing from non-literate sources and the theoretical insights of scholars outside the historical profession. Social, economic, and political historians often complain that incorporating non-literate sources and theoretical insights diminishes the ability of the historian to craft objective narratives based on verifiable evidence, on the truth. However, one need only turn to the pages of economic or agricultural history books and scholarly journals to realize just how theory-driven, empirical, evidence-based history can be. When economic historians turn to topics like sex and reproduction during slavery, the authors squeeze data, that is, evidence valued as factual, into predetermined economic models. These models allow the economic historian of slavery to conveniently deploy the benign language of rational utility and natural increase to describe economic motives and fluctuations in slave population size. No topic more clearly demonstrates these interpretive tensions and methodological myopia than slave breeding, a topic that historians, particularly economic historians, usually dismiss. As John Musgrave, the list owner of Illegality, an online history forum based hosted on Roots Web, reported in July 2000. Slave breeding is a controversial subject. I talked to historians who laugh at the possibility. I find that incredible that, economists, people who study capitalism and modern capitalism and the development of capitalism will find that it is improbable to think that slave masters, people who saw Black people, people racialized as Black, as non-human, and literally treated them like capital, took out bonds on their behalf, collateralized their own slaves to buy houses and start businesses and things like that. Killed them if they wanted to. They dehumanized, unhumanized these people in so many ways, but they find that naturally reproducing your own product would be somehow unthinkable. When people do that with dogs, we did that with other animals. And I'm not comparing Black folks to dogs, but I'm just saying, if you're a planter or an owner of something and you have an animal that you own or something that you have animalized, you can then think of all sorts of ways to try to maximize your capital and profit or your property, right? You can make it reproduce, right? If you have a dog, you just get another female dog and you make it reproduce. Why would that be so hard to imagine that slave owners would do? And I find that incredible that the mostly white economists don't believe the narratives of Black folks who are actually enslaved in chains and went through it. The book opens up with the narrative of somebody who was 108 years old on his deathbed, has no reason to lie, had lived as a poor Black man and was born a slave all his life, and is basically telling his, deathbed story to some worker from the WPA that, FDR sent out into the world. And he said, yeah, I remember there were two ladies. I mean, who can make up a story like that? Who can make up a story? For what gain? For what gain and for what purpose would somebody make up a story about two women, Long Peggy and Short Peggy, and they got their freedom after they were forced to have 25 children for their master? What is he going to gain from that? A spot on Oprah? Is he going to go viral? Is he going to get 1 million followers on TikTok? Like, what would be the reason to lie about that? That shows like how a lot of them who are not us do not view us as human. Because when we tell our stories, they say, no, that can't be real. We need more evidence. We don't care if there's 1 million Black folks who said, no, we saw the slave breeding happen. They would say, we need more evidence. You get what I'm saying? Continuing here. As a historian devoted to the interdisciplinary study of race, gender, and sexuality, I am familiar with the type of condescension Musgrave experienced. Too often, academic historians use tactics highlighting a misplaced comma, emphasizing an incorrectly typed statistic, alleging intentional errors in transcription, or disparaging the use of theoretical insights and non-literate sources that seek both to discredit historian of subaltern histories and to marginalize the individuals and groups these scholars write about. Examples of this abound. On September 1st, 2011, for instance, renowned historian Peter Wood advertised the arrival of a new book, The Jefferson Hemings Controversy, Reports of the Scholars Commission. Edited by Robert F. Turner, the book contains chapters by senior historians that, in general, discredit recent analyses of the sexual affair between Thomas Jefferson and his slave, Sarah Sally Hemings, an affair that produced at least one child. In particular, the contributors to the Jefferson Hemings controversy criticized the efficacy of DNA evidence, calling it junk science, and discredit leading scholars in the field. Most notably, Annette Gordon Reed is targeted for some sustained and biting criticism. Gordon Reed's work on the Jefferson Hemings affair has added invaluable new insights into the historical significance of race and sexuality in the founding of the American Republic. That the Jefferson Hemings controversy devotes so much attention to Gordon Reed's work reflects the impact she has had on historical writing and how some historians are displeased with this influence. So basically, if you don't know the story, Thomas Jefferson, famous guy who helped write the, Constitution, Declaration of Independence, blah, 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 one of the founding fathers, believes second president, right? Slave owner, raped a 14-year-old girl who was his slave when he was a grown-ass man well into his 30s, maybe even his 40s, raped his slave girl who was barely a teen, got her pregnant, and people thought that this was, just some old rumor, right? Black folks knew about this the entire time. You know, black folks were telling stories about Thomas Jefferson and how he was a sick pedophile. You know, it's crazy. We got R. Kelly in jail, but we got Thomas Jefferson on the money. We got Thomas Jefferson on what? The $2 bill? What is he on? Is he on the nickel? Something like that? I don't know. R. Kelly is in jail and his name is maligned forever. Thomas Jefferson is a national hero when they both did the same thing, sleep with underage girls. What does that tell you about white supremacy? But there's no white supremacy, right? But anyway, yeah, it's interesting. This, person was writing about, Thomas Jefferson and giving historical proof about Sally Hemings, and the historical community, the community of historians, the stuffy guys who sit on these big puffy couches and pontificate about the past. They said, no, this can never be true. This is not true. Thomas Jefferson was a good man. He would never sleep with a 14-year-old girl and get her pregnant and hide the affair and continually rape her over the years. Let's continue here, though. So most of the attacks made on Gordon Reed scholarship by the contributors to the Jefferson-Hemings controversy are petty. Peter Wood's insistence that the contributors to the Jefferson-Hemings controversy seek the facts of the particular case is therefore belied by the tenor of the volume. In the introduction, for instance, a lament for the professional demise of writer Brad Weiss and historian Michael Belisiles for plagiarism and fabrication of evidence, respectively, contextualizes an extraordinarily vitriolic attack on Gordon Reed. It is alleged, for instance, that while the careers of Weiss and Belisiles were torpedoed by allegations of plagiarism and the fabrication of evidence, Gordon Reed has apparently paid no price for what appears to be equally, if not more, serious transgressions against accepted standards of professional behavior. Under the pretense of quote-unquote objective, fact-finding history, the contributors to the Jefferson-Hemings controversy attempt to choke off debates about a topic that they find particularly uncomfortable. Slave breeding then comes with a warning. It deals with a very uncomfortable topic. It does so by exploring how multiple generations of African Americans have used the trope of slave breeding to emphasize the brutalities of slavery and its violent legacies. Few narrative tropes in African American culture are as powerfully evocative as slave breeding. It is a trope that has conveyed and continues to convey a sense of the trauma, endurance, and adaptive skills that Black Americans have needed to live under slavery and to envision how they might begin to prosper in the wake of that brutal regime's demise. For the antebellum era to the present day, African American memories of slave breeding practices have been part of the vernacular history of slavery. By vernacular history, I refer to understandings of the past that are often invisible to mainstream Americans and professional historians. To borrow from literary scholar Robert O'Mealy, vernacular histories include aspects of the American experience that do not get told in any other way than in art, theater, oral narratives, self-published memoirs, song, or dance. Slave breeding is just such a vernacular history. It allows us to begin to understand how these memories foster historical understandings of sexual violence, capture the connection between life and death in a racially structured society, and highlight the importance of family. As with the production of all memoirs and historical writing, this was and continues to be an active, creative process in Black culture. It is a process that can be set in motion by a word, an image, a phrase, a song, a dance, or a story, or a Tariq Nasheed post. I think what he's trying to get at here, in my opinion, is saying like this is, not officially written down history. This is not the tradition. To compose this book and this story, we cannot go to the traditional sources. There's no book that a slave explicitly wrote, or a book that a slave master wrote saying, hey, here was slave breeding, this is what we did, or this is what happened to me, This is like oral passed down history that also ends up flowing downstream into culture, right? And so a lot of the things that exist now within Black American culture, right, are flowing downstream from our traumatic experience in slavery as well. You can look at the food, you can look at dance, you can look at how we interpret religion as well. Like a lot of that flows downstream from our experiences, and also language we use and ideas that we have about what happened into our ancestral past, or in our ancestral past, reflect also in how we think about ourselves, right? So this is like recently, there's been this whole idea of buck breaking. The idea or the oral history, or this new way of thinking about what happened traumatically in our, past as slaves, that, black men used to get raped by white men in front of a whole crowd of slaves as a way to break the strongest, most rebellious black man's spirit to fight back and fight for freedom and stuff like that, right? So, you know, that's there's probably no written account of that, but the fact that that idea exists reflects, number one, maybe a true oral history that has been passed down, and secondly, how we are thinking about the trauma that happened, right? And I mean, slavery, the transatlantic black racial capitalistic slave system that existed from Canada to Brazil, Chile, Argentina, and everywhere in between, right? Like that thing, there were millions of people who went through that, and there are millions of stories that are lost to time. So anything is possible, right? If you could think of something happening right now, it's probably happening right now in the world. And if you could think about anything right now, it definitely happened in the past, right? So, you know, I think that's what he's trying to get at here. I'm going to continue here. So, the trope of slave breeding provides African Americans with a well of deep memories. That is, slave breeding focuses narratives about slavery on its brutalities and its legacy. The racial violence associated with the sexual assault of Black domestics, race riots and lynchings, and challenges to family and community stability since the 13th Amendment to the Constitution abolished slavery in 1865. Thus, African Americans have nurtured narratives about slave breeding in political speeches and autobiographies of the 19th century, in abolitionist propagandizing, in religious sermons and oral histories, political testimonies and folklore, and in plays, movies, and literary fiction. Historically, these sources have engaged with the broader American culture in which they were produced and became part of Black America's historical and political discourse in slavery and freedom. Since the passage of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act in 1964 and 1965, Americans have become hyper aware of topics like slave breeding and the legacy of slavery in American society. In general, most Americans try to avoid such topics, but on occasion, avoidance is no longer an option. This was the case in 1988 when Jimmy, the Greek Snyder, a sportscaster for CBS television, attempted to explain why African American athletes dominated professional sports in the United States. Snyder remarked, "The slave owner would breed his big black with his big woman so that he would have a big black kid." Snyder concluded, "The black is a better athlete to begin with because he was bred to be that way." The editors of Jet magazine referred to Snyder's remarks as a slur against Black athletes. Executives at CBS television agreed and terminated the network's association with the controversial sportscaster. That video clip that he's referring, that incident he's referring to, is a video clip that you can easily find on YouTube and hear coming out of this white man's mouth, right? And the sexual trauma that we go through as Black people goes kind of like two ways. In some ways, that we, relish the attention to be looked at as sexually dominant or sexually desirable. But it also works against us to make them think, number one, in the minds of the white folks and white supremacists, that, they sort of created their own monster to some degree. And that still makes us a monstrosity in their eyes because they look at us as these, twisted creatures that they have created, sort of like orcs, right? In like Middle Earth, right? These people who have been twisted and corrupted and made permanently foul and unclean. And secondly, you can't have, both things, right? Like the way humans think about things, if we see a guy who has a lot of muscles, we tend to think he's not smart, right? And if we see a guy who is reading a book all the time, we tend to think he's not athletic, right? If we see a girl with big breasts, we tend to think she's not going to be the one to talk politics with. In general, right? If we see a girl with glasses, we tend to think, oh, we can have a nice chat in Starbucks about, the sun, moon, and stars. I mean, that's generally how people think. We tend to think that, people do not have all qualities, or we tend to think people lack in areas where they seem to excel in others, right? That's the same thing how it works with us, like in blackness in its mind. Like they say that we have big old penises and big booties and we're these sexual dynamos and that sort of stuff, but then they say, well, Negroes, they're not that smart too, right? So it's a very complex thing. I wonder if he's going to break it down even more in this book. And once again, we're only in the introduction, and here I am rambling. But let's continue here. So some 15 years after Snyder's ill-fated remarks, a similar set of comments inflamed media and public opinion once again. In 2003, then manager of the Chicago Cubs baseball team, Dusty Baker, reignited debates over the link between Black athletes, slavery, and racial inheritance. Baker asserted, "I like playing in the heat. Most Latin people and minority people do. You don't find too many brothers from New Hampshire or Maine, right? We were brought over here because we could work in the heat. Isn't that history?" Oh, that's so cringe. Oh, that's cringe. Oh, that's so cringe. Because I hate when black folks say, bruh, we black, bruh. We good with the heat. Nah, nigga, you good with the heat. I like the cold. I'm gonna be in Maine playing in the snow in more ways than one. If you get what I'm talking, I'm joking. But I hate when we do this race essentialism. When we say like, yo, because we're black, or even worse, because we're African, somehow we're well adapted to the heat and we're well adapted to warmer climates and humidity and that sort of stuff. Oh, that's so frustrating, because that says that gives credence to what the white folks said. Like, yeah, black folks were right to be our slaves, and they're naturally meant to be our beasts of burden, because they are meant to be worked out in the field. Their skin can't get burnt. They're naturally strong. They're naturally docile. They can deal with all sorts of climates that that are, as long as they are warm and hot, they'll be fine. Put them in the cold and they'll die. You get what I'm saying? Like, these sorts of ideas really like continue to keep us back. Let's not do that. Let's not do that, brothers. Anyway, coming from a well-known and likable black celebrity, Baker's comments reflected a shared history of racial consciousness, where Snyder's remarks were interpreted as a slur by many blacks because they implied that African-American athletes achieve success only through their genetic inheritance. Baker spoke to the idea of Black American success being achieved against a historical backdrop of intense racism. No, I disagree. I don't interpret it that way for the reasons I said before. And lurking in the subtext of Baker's comments was an allusion to one of the most profound forms of human exploitation in Black historical memory: the coerced, often violent selection of Africans and African Americans to be slaves because of their perceived physical attributes. The biological section that Baker alludes to reflects the active ways in which Black Americans articulate and rearticulate memories of slave breeding in contemporary culture. In September 2009, for example, en route from my temporary home in New Haven, Connecticut to the nearby airport, my shuttle driver asked me what I do for a living. I offered up a generic answer: I'm a historian of U.S. history, slavery mainly, upon which he stated, they bred slaves. What followed was the retelling of a deeply moving family history that began in slavery and slave breeding in Louisiana. I asked if he thought his family history with slave breeding warranted reparations from the federal government. He responded, not unlike the civil rights activists of the 1950s and 60s, that it did not, that Black people simply needed the government to pass and police laws that would allow African Americans to rise on their own merits. What struck me about this encounter was the matter-of-fact nature with which this particular gentleman, a working class Black man with no investment in academic artifice or historiographical debates, related his family history. I mean, if Louisiana, baby, every time Louisiana pops up in the book, I'm always going to rep that. So I'm happy to see Louisiana popping up so early, because I know it's going to be more in this story. But yeah, man, everybody's, Black family has a story that they pass down, and it's traumatic, it's gross, it's dark, it's wicked, right? And, I just remember being at my grandma's house and just overhearing those parlor talk, conversations when all the grown folks were downstairs, and they said, all you children need to go to sleep. You know what I mean? This grown folks business now. And I overheard them conversations about all sorts of like family history that just makes me, glad to be here and appreciative of my ancestors. But Yeah, man, I'm not surprised to hear that. And I'm glad he wasn't surprised to hear that too. I'm talking about the author. But once again, it's amazing how Black people can be telling the same story. We can all be saying the same thing, that racism exists, police brutality is bad, there's disenfranchisement at many different parts of our society. And white folks say, we need more evidence. Continue here. I have encountered similarly direct statements about slave breeding from Black scholars and authors of fiction. For instance, Elizabeth Nunez has Anna, the central character in her novel, Anna in Between, accuse slave owners of breeding slaves for profit. I asked Nunez about this scene and the inspiration behind it. She stated that for her, stories of slave breeding came inseparable from the stories I heard about slavery. I never questioned it. It seemed the obviously horrible thing slave owners would do, like Washington using his slaves' teeth to have dentures made for himself. Supposedly, he paid them for their teeth, but I often wondered if the slave had the option of selling their teeth to him. I followed this question by asking Nunez if she thinks slave breeding is something that occupies a popularly accepted part of the African American and Afro-Caribbean writer's historical memory. To this question, she replied, "Yes, I do. It's a central part of any discussion on the states of Black families and the absence of fathers in the lives of children." Zakes Mda's evocative novel, Scion, published in 2007, also grapples with the memory of slave breeding. Mda, a literary scholar and novelist at Ohio University, sets Scion in rural Ohio. Here he explores the origins and implications of mixed-race Americans. In Scion, racial mixing has very brutal origins indeed. On a fictional plantation in Fredericksburg, Virginia, the Fairfield family operates a slave breeding plantation. Historians often insist that for slave breeding to have occurred there must have existed some sort of science and/or strict management to the system. This is not the case in Scion. Imda writes that the breeding process was not formalized or planned in any scientific manner. Children happened when they did and were sold just before they reached their teens. Indeed, the violence associated with interracial sex and slave breeding practices on the Fairfield plantation evokes distressing images. Inbreeding is common, as are binge parties, in which young men from nearby colleges join David Fairfield, the son of plantation owner Charles Fairfield, in indulging their addictions for Black pussy. I asked Imda about the inspiration for the portrayal of such sexual violence. He responded that his initial source for slave breeding was J.A. Rogers' Sex and Race, a history of white, Negro, and Indian miscegenation in the two Americas. Imda noted that as an organic historian, the largely self-trained Rogers was not highly regarded by the Academy. So to flesh out his portrayal of slave breeding and the inspiration for the Fairfield plantation, Imda did some archival research, finding some of the letters and articles by the Virginia lawyer and slave owner George Fitzhugh enlightening on the subject. These stories are striking for their narrative synergy, the blunt, matter-of-fact nature of the knowledge narrated, and the connection between historical wrongs and 20th and 21st century racial questions and anxieties give such narratives their deep meaning. These stories belong to an African American culture and oral tradition that incorporates memories of slave breeding into what Thomas Abercrombie refers to as a social memory. Social memory is an active and creative process in which people constitute themselves and their social formations and communicative actions and interactions, making themselves by making rather than inheriting their past. By making rather. Okay, interesting. In this sense, the political, social, historical, and popular narratives of slave breeding that Black Americans have woven into and out of their understanding of slavery since the 19th century demand serious scholarly attention. I don't know if this is exactly the same thing, but it makes me think about, Tiananmen Square, right? And like in China, the history of Tiananmen Square, what happened when student protesters are trying to protest against the communist government of China, and then they brought the tanks out and the guns and people were killed. That's been wiped out of like mainland Chinese textbook history, right? But that doesn't mean that people in China still don't remember that. Of course, some people might be ignorant and might not know that it actually happened, but there is that social memory from the people that were there, from the people that remember seeing it on TV or reading about it in the newspaper or hearing about it from other people. That social memory can still exist. It doesn't, even if every book, every picture, every image of it was wiped out. And I know that's hard for Tiananmen Square because we have the famous picture of the tank man, right? But it's so crazy that people will say, no, Tiananmen Square actually happened, even though, hypothetically, let's say in the future, there is no historical record of it because it could be wiped clean from the internet, right? But slave breeding did not happen, even though only 500,000 Black people were imported into America. And quickly, over the years, by the time the Civil War happened, there were around 10 million Black folks in the US. How do you go from, 500,000 people imported into the US, and then you get 10 million? You either have to believe that Black folks were not working all day out in the fields or in the houses, and we were just literally having sex. The white folks invited us into the US to have massive orgies with each other. Or there was a systematized way that people who looked at Black people as property sought to reproduce their property as much as they can and as cheap as possible. Why buy slaves when I have one woman here and one man and I can make them fuck and I can have more profit? I mean, it's just common sense. But the fact that, there are some historians and some people, unfortunately, that think that this didn't happen when logically it makes sense. Under any other circumstance, it would make sense, right? For any other type of property that you might own or anything that would accumulate capital. Let's continue here. So these stories are striking for their narrative synergy. So social, okay, did I already read this part? No, these stories are striking for their narrative synergy, the blunt matter-of-fact nature of the knowledge narrated, and the connection between historical wrongs and 20th and 21st century racial questions and anxieties give such narratives their deep meaning. These stories belong to an African-American culture and oral tradition that incorporates memories of slave breeding into what Thomas Abercrombie refers to as social memory. Social memory is an active and creative process in which people constitute themselves and their social formations and communicative actions and interactions, making themselves by making rather than inheriting their past. That sentence still doesn't make sense to me. And by the way, I know I'm reading this paragraph again, but it's mostly for this sentence. By making rather than inheriting their past. Oh, by making rather than inheriting their past. I see. Okay, I get it now. So people are making their own past as a way of dealing with trauma, but also sort of like, putting one and two together on how they got here as well. In this sense, the political, social, historical, and popular narratives of slave breeding that Black Americans have woven into and out of their understanding of slavery since the 19th century demand serious scholarly attention. For slaves, former slaves, and the descendants of slaves, slave breeding buttresses memories of the violent sexual exploitation of African American women, the abuse and sale of enslaved children, and the hegemonic white majority's seeming power to define the parameters of life and death for Black Americans. During slavery, the progeny of the coercive sexual mating between enslaved couples or the sexual manipulation, including what we would understand today as rape of slave women by white men, and on occasion Black men, was and continues to be remembered by African Americans as a source of wealth for slave owners and slave traders. But as I noted above, slave breeding is much more than this. In the different forms of memory produced by Black people since the 19th century, slave breeding became critical to historical explanations of the racial and sexual objectification of Black bodies, of the distortion of ideals regarding gender roles between Black men and Black women, of the fragile nature of Black family life, and of the need for African Americans to craft narratives that make sense of the brutal ways in which life can be conceived and snuffed out. For instance, through interracial rape and lynchings in a racist society. History, the historian, and slave breeding in American culture. As the above discussion suggests, slave breeding occupies an inglorious and contested place in the American historical imagination. Professional historians are certainly a long way from reaching a consensus on this topic. As we have seen, Fogel and Engerman became the standard bearers for the economic historians' narrow approach to slave breeding in the 1970s. But a competing narrative also existed in the 1970s. This alternative approach to slave breeding emerged with the rise of the new social history of the 60s and 70s. Practitioners of this brand of history took a broader, more critical approach to the analysis of slave breeding than scholars engaged in economic history. Most notably, Alfred H. Conrad and John R. Meyer, as well as Herbert Gutman and Richard Stutch, insisted that efforts to breed slaves in the Upper South for sale in the slave states of the Lower South did indeed exist. In a famous 1976 essay, Gutman and Such defined slave breeding as any practice of the slave master intended to cause the fertility of the slave population to be higher than it would have been in the absence of such interference. Although Gutman backtracked on the impact of slave breeding on Black family life in The Black Family and Slavery and Freedom in 1977, in collaboration with Such, Gutman argued that slave breeding practices included rewards such as more comfortable living quarters, better and greater quantities of food, and/or lightened workload. Scholars with a much more rigid approach to economic and demographic history dismiss such arguments. They look at the data on slave reproduction, births, deaths, and sales, and do not believe slave breeding practices were a reality of plantation life. For example, Barry Higman, a historian of West Indian slavery, argues that the broader definition of slave breeding has little value as a means of distinguishing the manipulation of fertility in slave and free societies, and there seemed to be little gained from pursuing this debate. Despite Higman's attempt to shut down historical debate about slave breeding, scholars still do engage the topic. In the compelling Becoming Southern, published in 1995, Christopher Morris details how Judge Alexander Covington and his nephew Edmund left Natchez, Mississippi, and established a new plantation on 2,000 acres in the south end of Warren County, near the Big Black River. Here, Morris explains, the Covingtons developed a business strategy that allowed them to cultivate an image of themselves as planter elites. The strategy was to raise young Negroes rather than crops. Morris contends that the Covingtons' desire to raise young Negroes locked masters and slaves into a shared interest in slave family formation. Whereas slaves longed for stable and emotionally supportive families, slave masters like the Covingtons valued slave families because they had much to gain by attempting to increase the birth rate of their slaves. And so they endeavored to do just that. Evidently, the Covingtons were a smashing success at such endeavors, as neighbors testified that they succeeded very well in raising young Negroes. I wonder who are the descendants of the Covingtons today. Y'all best not have money. Imagine you are rich today because your great-great-great-great-granddaddy made niggas fuck. Imagine if you balling out of control and you just white in America and like you got all that money because, you know, your daddy was the fluffer for the buck. Your daddy fluffed up the buck. I'm sorry. So, all right. Intimate human relations, as a literary scholar, Saidiya Hartman observes, can involve brutal power and authority and do not necessarily encompass consensual physical and emotional encounters. They often involve great degradation, and that, not coincidentally, leaves little empirical evidence in the archives that professional historians usually consult. Methodological agility is therefore necessary when surveying the different cultural and historical contexts through which the topic of slave breeding has been filtered. This is because debates about the utility, much less the existence of slave breeding, has circulated throughout the Atlantic world in various genres since the late 18th century. To begin to understand the circulation of this information, a brief historical overview is necessary. According to the sociologist Eddie Donahue, Denmark became the first European power to explicitly propose a scheme for the breeding of slaves. Damn, and I like the Danes too. I like those Danish cookies that come in that big can. Who knew that they were so whack? In 1791, the Danish Committee for Improving the Organization of the Slave Trade in the West Indian Islands and the Guinea Coast established what Donahue calls a blueprint for breeding African slaves. British slave interests shared the Danish preoccupation with breeding slaves at a time when the abolition of imported slaves from West Africa to the British Caribbean appeared imminent. Britons with an interest in Caribbean slavery expressed a mixture of views about slave breeding. While historians remain divided over whether slave breeding was practiced on a larger scale in the British Caribbean, evidence suggests that both British parliamentarians and West Indian slave owners and overseers were increasingly focused on slave reproduction after the 1780s and 1790s. These were decades in which British abolitionists raised their voices in unison against the transatlantic slave trade, prompting some with an investment in Caribbean slavery to look to other means to ensure a steady supply of slave labor. As Sampson Wood, the manager of Newton Estate, reported in 1797, "I encourage the slaves breeding as much as I can." In the United States, the slaveholders took a keen interest in these European debates. This interest was reflected in travel writing, contemporary histories, plantation manuals, and agricultural publications such as DeBell's Review. In 1787, for example, John Lang, a white farm owner living in disputed territory between Georgia and the Creek Nation, lost his 12-year-old slave girl to Creek Indian warriors. Long intended to use Lucy to reproduce slaves for his farmstead. And evidently, the Creek slave master who took possession of Lucy had similar ideas. Wow. So these people kidnapped a 12-year-old girl and they're fighting over her. And when you read this, you think, oh man, that nice Native American man came to save that 12-year-old girl from that wicked white man who was gonna make her get pregnant and have children right away by grown-ass men having sex with her in the barn. Nope, the Indian said, I'm going to do that too. Okay, that's crazy. Wow, we got no allies. I know I said earlier we need white allies. We need just white friends. We need Native American friends, man. Y'all are over here kidnapping 12-year-old girls trying to get them pregnant. That's wild. Evidently, the Creek slave master who took possession of Lucy had similar ideas, as she eventually became a grandmother while still enslaved in the Creek Nation. Other lurid stories of reproduction abound. In 1800, the African-American writer William T. Alexander argued in his History of the colored race in America that slave breeding for gain, deliberately and systematically pursued, appears to be among the latest devices and illustrations of inhumanity. Travel writers also added to 19th century discourse about the existence of slave breeding. William Faw, an English farmer and amateur travel writer, published in 1823 a revealing account of life in the American South. Faw described his travels through the United States and introduced readers to a South Carolinian by the name of Patrick Duncan. According to Faw, Duncan knew a young gentleman who once bought a Negro wench, the only slave he ever purchased. But at his death, his heirs divided 70 slaves amongst them, all her offspring and posterity, during a period of only 35 years. Frederick Law Olmsted, a Northerner who made several trips to the South, also observed the practice of slave breeding. In a journey in the seaboard slave states in the years of 1853 to 1854, and a journal to the Back County, 1861, Olmsted argued that slave breeding was profitably practiced in portions of Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, Kentucky, and Missouri. In addition to South Carolina, where the climate was mild and the management of slaves was profitably geared toward increasing rates of human reproduction. This is insane, man. This is deep history, man. Deep history. All right, we're almost done. We're almost done. Only a few more pages left, so just wanted to check real quick. All right. I know nobody's in here, but y'all watch this on the playback on 2X. It's much better on 2X. Trust me. All right. Let's go here. All right. So back on this page. So by the antebellum period, slave breeding had become a topic of intense debate at virtually every level of American culture and society. Within the private correspondence of slave owners and in the public instructions given to plantation overseers, masters liberally dispensed advice on how best to encourage successful breeding practices. Take the South Carolina planter James Henry Hammond, who gave explicit instructions to overseers on how to encourage marriage, quote unquote, and ensure the good health of pregnant slave women and young children. While the law did not recognize slave marriages, slave owners such as Hammond encouraged the union between enslaved men and women because it had the potential to increase the slave population and thus the profits of the master. Marriage is to be encouraged, Hammond's instructions read, as it adds to the comfort, happiness, and health of those who enter upon it, besides ensuring a greater increase. Got to take another sneeze break, man. Maybe it's allergies. Maybe it's allergies. All right. So every effort was thus made on Hammond's plantation to ensure the survival of newborn slave children. Pregnant women at 5 months are put in the sucklers, breastfeeding women's gang. No plowing or lifting must be required of them. While pregnant women on the plantation had their manual labor reduced during the later stages of pregnancy, breastfeeding women were charged with the important task of ensuring the health and well-being of the infant slaves. Hammond instructed that sucklers are not required to leave their houses until sunrise, when they leave their children at the children's house before going to the field. The period of suckling is 12 minutes. I hope so. I hope it's not milliseconds. No, it's minutes. 12 minutes. Their work lies always within half mile of the quarter. They are required to be cool before commencing to suckle, to wait 15 minutes at least in summer after reaching the children's house after nursing. Such clear directions indicate some slave owners' desire for, if not a sophisticated medical understanding of the reproduction of the slave population and the breeding of nominally healthy slaves. Hammond was not alone among slave owners in encouraging slave reproduction. On his Virginia plantation, Pharsalia, William Massey purchased slave women who, according to the family records, played important roles as breeders. The slave women, Judy, Millie, Sally, Rachel, Sookie, Matilda, and Hannah, all feature prominently. You sound like the members of Destiny's Child. All feature prominently in Massey plantation records because they were considered particularly fecund bearers of slave children. The Massey family recorded births and monitored the mothering skills of enslaved women. For example, the slave woman Lizzie gave birth to a son, Gabriel, on June 21st, 1856. However, a subsequent entry records that Gabriel was murdered outright by his mother's neglect and barbarous cruelty on the 22nd of September, 1857. The monitoring of slave mothers, whom planters assumed lacked nurturing instincts and possessed deficient mothering skills, was regularly practiced at Pharsalia. That said, marriage was also encouraged among the enslaved at Pharsalia, just as it was on Hammond's plantation. But neither Hammond nor the Massey family promised marriage out of any heartfelt concern for the economic well-being of the enslaved. Instead, slave marriages were designed to maximize the efficiency and profitability of the Massey and Hammond plantations. Such practices reminded slaves of who was in control, who oppressed them, and who had the power to assent to the creation of life, or to define the terms on which a slave's life ended. The defenders of antebellum slavery denied accusations that slaves were sexually exploited or that they reproduced children for the slave owners' commercial gain. Instead, slavery's apologists asserted that slave owners acted with compassion and patriarchal concern for the enslaved. For example, the Barbour County Agricultural Society of Alabama attempted to contradict a growing wave of abolitionist opposers to slavery when it reported in 1841 that because the slave is a valuable piece of property, we can readily conceive how strongly the motive of the master in taking good care of the slave, and thus extending the time of its usefulness. It was therefore a simple matter of economic self-interest that motivated the slave owner to ensure the good health of its crop of slaves and to ensure that the slave's life as a productive laborer or a reproducer of new slaves continued for as long as possible. However, this, according to the pro-slavery this, according to the pro-slavery lobby, was not slave breeding. It merely reflected the paternalism that governed the slave owner's economic decisions and actions on behalf of his slave. Slave owners persisted throughout the antebellum period with this type of self-description, treating and managing the Negro with a view to increasing their cheerfulness. If this meant that the rate of slave reproduction increased, all the better. It did not mean, however, that the effort was being made. All right. So it did not mean, however, that efforts were being made to select and biologically engineer future generations. For example, if the winning entry in 1851, Planter Prize Easy, competition in Georgia instructed readers that females during a state of emergency should be exempted from all fencing, etc. And for several weeks previous to confinement, they should be required to perform no outdoor labor. All right, despite persistent denials of all this advice amounted to uh, persistent denials of all this advice amounted to a desire in theoretical, if not in scientific know-how, on the pair, driving us on the part of slave owning and slave trading interests to maximize profits through exploitative labor regimes and reproductive reproductive practices. All right. Can you let's do this. Let's do this. We might have to wrap it up, man. We might have to wrap it up because even though there's only a few pages left, I'm getting sleepy. I'm getting sleepy. Sleepy. So I don't even think I can keep going because as you see, I'm messing up right here. I've been up. I only got like 4 hours of sleep, so I don't even think I'm ready and up for all this. So might have to wrap it up. Sorry, guys. We didn't finish the introduction. We're like halfway through it. So we'll pick up here on this page 14 or 27 in the PDF next time we read. And I hope y'all enjoyed this book. And we're going to be continuing on this series, reading this book for Black History Month. Deep apologies to everybody who's watching this in the playback and is like, oh, Simon, no, I wanted to see the rest. Listen, we'll read the introduction and also all of chapter 1 as well. And also drop a movie review as well. So y'all be easy out there and peace.